A crucial part of learning camera craft is exposure. I think that's pretty well self-evident. Poor exposure has a much greater impact on our photography than many people realize, even some of those who have been handling a camera for some time. If space permits, I will try and cover one or two of these issues a little later. Exposure is one of those subjects that, in one way or another, we're going to be returning to in many of these videos. We can't cover the subject of exposure too much. To really master camera craft and our photography, there are some things we must become fluent with, and exposure is probably the most important, and it's pretty crucial to everything else. So exposure is where I'd like to start by setting the scene for the rest of the videos. My intention is to suggest a way forward that I believe will make exposure easier to understand and therefore easier to learn. When we frame up on an image using any modern digital camera, we are likely to see the aperture and shutter speeds shown to us somewhere on that camera. Here we're looking at the back of a digital SLR. We can see tucked in the top left corner of the LCD, we're being shown the shutter speed, a 320th of a second, and the aperture, f3.2. So if you look at the aperture setting I have here, it's not going to be uncommon to see values like this. The aperture reading of f3.2, f6.3 or f9.5. If we look up into the top left corner of the LCD, we can see the shutter speed being displayed, 320th of a second. But we're going to see lots of different values just like apertures, and another one could be 160th of a second. When we were using film cameras prior to modern electronics, we wouldn't see apertures or shutter speeds shown on our cameras quite the same as we do today. They looked a little different. We wouldn't have seen f numbers like f9.5. We would have either seen f8 or f11 because f9.5 falls between these two. So it's only in the digital world, where our cameras have now become mini computers, that we begin to see these mid-range values like 6.3, 4.5 or 9.2. And there are times when we just can have a little too much detail. I'm going to suggest this may be one of them. So throughout these videos we're going to tactfully ignore all of those modern values, like the ones you can see on screen, that our cameras create, and we're going to concentrate on what we call whole stops. Now typically we may see apertures shown like this, although different lenses may have a greater or shorter range of apertures, but this is pretty typical and it's going to be plenty for our needs. Looking up at the top left there, we can see the f-stop is set at 2.8. If we compare f4 in comparison to f2.8, what we've effectively done there is to make a smaller hole in the lens via the aperture, and we'll see this a little bit more graphically later on. That's reduced the amount of light falling onto the sensor by one stop. If we were to move from f4 to 5.6, we would see a similar thing. f5.6 is a smaller hole in the lens, so we're reducing light still further, and if we look between f4 and 5.6, once again it's one stop. Now I'm sure you're already seeing a pattern here. The exposure difference between every setting is one stop. So working from left to right, each setting represents a halving of the light falling on the sensor. If we work right to left, we would be doubling the light between each aperture setting. If we move on to the shutter speeds, and these are pretty typical too, but like apertures, some cameras have a much greater range than this, but once again, there's more than enough here for our needs. Let's look at the shutter speed at the extreme left, which is currently set to half a second. If we speed up the shutter speed to a quarter of a second, what we've just done is to change the exposure by one stop. We've just halved the exposure from half a second to a quarter of a second because the shutter is working faster, less light can reach the sensor. Now I'm pretty sure you may already be one step ahead of me because there is the same one-stop difference between each and every one of those shutter speeds. So when we move through those shutter speeds from left to right, we're speeding up the shutter one stop each time. Therefore, we're reducing the light falling on the sensor by half each time. If we move from right to left, we're slowing down the shutter, giving more time for light to fall onto the sensor, so in fact we're doubling the light between each setting. Now let's take a look at typical ISO settings, and I very much doubt that you're going to be all that surprised with what we see. The exposure changes are the equivalent of one stop between each setting. 200 ISO makes the sensor more sensitive to light in comparison to 100 ISO. So in effect, we would be doubling the exposure. So once again, if we move left to right along the ISO scale, we are doubling the exposure each time. If we move right to left, then we're halving the exposure each time. But you will note across the entire screen, the gap between each of the apertures, shutter speeds and ISO is considered one stop. Now I believe it's going to be beneficial if we use these whole stops throughout these videos and not allow ourselves to be confused by a myriad of midway settings that modern digital cameras can deliver.